Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today I'm talking about the new album from ALEPH, Ego Death. Alright then, so I've been hearing quite a bit of buzz surrounding this project. First heard about it through one of my regular commenters' fan ranking, then Ryan from Not Real Music recommended it to me and gave it a pretty glowing review. Then I heard it got some traction from the Rate Your Music crowd. I saw this guy's name among a lineup of artists from the Upscale label and adjacent crowd to that, doing a live festival on Twitch next week. And even a plug from Amon Tobin through the No Mark Records Twitter. It's been drawing a lot of excitement from all around, so of course I had to give it a shot myself. I've actually been sitting with it for quite a while now, deciding how I feel on it. I think it came out last month or something. Or at the beginning of this month. Though right off the bat, it sounded to me like a mix of sounds pulled out of the likes of Sakura Burst's Deconstructing Nature, Koan Sound's Polychrome, and Rob Clouth's 0 Point. Which is only a good thing in all cases. Yes, we have a new addition to this current wave of modern IDM-type artists in the same vein as those on the Upscale roster, among others, as I mentioned. I've given out glowing reviews to nearly everyone who's put out a project in this style, and surprise, this is not going to be any exception. Yeah, for the most part, I can pretty much confirm the hype this project's been getting in all directions. I thought it was great all around, from its tight construction to its spot-on production quality, to even its variety and pacing, just really well done across the board. Now, I don't think this project is going to be anything game-changing. ALEPH is not at the point where I would be able to recognize his sound from a distance, and this album didn't explore any territory in this genre that I hadn't already heard before several times. And its somewhat anonymous approach did lead to this album needing a while to grow on me. And there are other minor issues I have and may as well get out of the way, most notably the inclusion of a few voice samples that get introduced in some tracks, especially the intro and the title track, that talk about twisting reality with computers, talking in Technicolor because of having done a lot of drugs as a part of some kind of medical test or something like that. And stuff like that. While I do like the way these voice snippets sound, they're somewhat lo-fi sound quality, and the way they're placed in the mix kind of reminding me of The Orb. The stuff these samples are actually saying can sometimes feel like a shallow device to make the album seem even bigger and more important than it is, when that wasn't entirely necessary. Hearing that woman on the title track ramble on about the endless beauty she's experiencing could feel like ALEPH was, congratulating himself for how good his sound design was. And even if I kinda doubt that was really what he intended, whatever the case, I still kinda thought that was corny and might have been better to just let the music speak for itself. But despite those voice snippets occasionally rubbing me the wrong way, first of all, I can tune them out. They're not the most bothersome thing ever. And second of all, I don't actually think this album falls for the same trap as something like Polychrome or Tipper's Jettison Mind Hatch, where the sound design is getting so much focus at the expense of the deeper emotional core. This album still makes sure that the core fundamentals like the grooves and overall atmosphere are still strong enough to support all the usual crazy details and glitches on top. Yeah, it's not one of my new, giant favorite projects in this style, but it is a hell of a promising debut regardless. Now, when going through individual tracks, it is worth noting that this album is a really tight, continuous mix in which each track is directly being built into the next one, and more like they're all just pieces of the same whole that you can't fully take out of context. But they all certainly each add something of substance and have their own individual identities. R.E.M. is an excellent intro to this project that lets you know what you're getting into. Lots of banging metallic beats that have a distinct UK garage kind of bounce to them, but slowly introducing some brighter melodic elements that get more and more focus as you go along, until all the beats are left behind in favor of all these plucking harp melodies. I'm not the first to this comparison, but the mix is very similar to John Hopkins at that guy's most experimental Insides era work. And the track Polymer directly continues all the ideas from the intro, but practically just smashes that whole groove into pieces. Ends up sounding more like some old mid-2010s modern dubstep drop or something, and even adding lots of stutter edits and glitching the entire track up. These first two tracks are basically one and the same, and even though they add up to 8 minutes total, they seem to zip by in half the time. It's all really freaking good. Similar feelings on a track like Noise Floor, which has this really thumping industrial feel to it that combines that John Hopkins-y garage beat with some colder and more metallic textures and atmospheres that give the whole thing a Monolake-ish feel, especially in that first half. At least until that whole ambient side track leading back into the stronger bass line, which just leads it to sound like a cut from Immunity again. But I will not complain there. But as great as these tracks are, it's the airier and more melodic tracks like Breathe that really pulled me into this thing. Especially love the progression of piano chords that this composition is built on. It's super emotionally resonant, and the way they work against all the glittering synths and quirky effects hit a very Hudson Lee sort of note for me in the best possible way. Yeah, Breathe had to be my single favorite track on the album, and there's a few other major gems in that vein near the end too. Like Retrospect, which takes the same kinds of sounds, but he attaches them to this bouncy and almost jazzy lo-fi hip-hop influenced beat or something, while Recovery puts a lot more focus on the pianos themselves, and goes for a much more stripped-back, ambient-centric approach, and unsurprisingly is another one of the biggest emotional high points, and those two tracks complement and lead into each other perfectly. Also, I gotta say, the pacing on this album is excellent, and the way even all the little interlude tracks feel like they add something of importance. Like, there's a wide variety of track lengths here. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 minutes. But aside from the final two cuts, most of these tracks feel like they go on about the same length of time. Sure, a track like Particle of Id may not really add much besides low-key ambience and clicking noises, but I still notice it when it happens, and it feels like it serves its purpose. And some of these shorter cuts can even become bigger favorites, like the super expansive and windy ambience of Decomposition. That one sounded freaking amazing. And especially that 7th track, let's call it the Receding Black Bar one. That track goes harder than any other cut on here by a fairly substantial margin, and that should be saying something. It's just so explosive and noisy and chaotic and fast-paced. The crashing metallic sounds sound somewhere between, like, Sophie at her most abrasive and Oudiker's Xi. It's nuts, and I love every bit of it. Though, as the title implies, the track does recede and get quieter as it goes on, and just, like, slowly dies down into little plinky keyboards. Awesome that a 2-minute track can hit with just as much impact and importance, if not even more, than the 6-minute cut it immediately follows. Another one of my biggest favorites here. Now, there are a few cuts here that I'm not as huge on. Essence Recall Artifact Mix, that one's nice, has kind of like a wavering beat that slowly plods along, and has a few neat xylophone-ish tones throughout. Though I didn't feel like that one added anything to the album that wasn't done better by any number of other cuts on here. It kind of felt like the exact average of the album sound without really doing anything to stand out in its own right. Still fits into the pacing pretty well, though. I never felt the urge to skip it. And then you got something like the title track, which goes on for 10 minutes, and perhaps unfortunately that's the one moment where I felt like it probably didn't need to go on that long. I'm really conflicted on this one, though, because the first half of this track is amazing. It starts out in this mix of chopped-up vocal samples and banging beats that seems like a direct homage to Burial Style, and blends into this really dramatic ambient section that introduces all these beautiful flute sounds. But after the first 3 minutes, we switch over into these darker and much less melodic sounds that switch between industrial grooves and spooky ambience, which is also good, but not as good as that first segment. And at the 8-minute mark, we just get a long-winded outro of mildly pretty, but also somewhat empty-sounding ambience and those voice snippets that I was mentioning before. The first 3 minutes of this track could have ended up as one of my easy favorites from this album if taken separately, but the last 3 minutes or so, if that were its own track, that would be my easy least favorite if taken separately. I wish the sounds from that first half had been developed more and more focused on, instead of getting a whole section dedicated to some lady talking to her doctor about how amazing these drugs are. As is, the title track is a good track, neither a favorite or a least favorite. And he does thankfully pull me back in with one last melodic track to close things out in Endless Dream, which once again combines all these pianos with glittering synth plucks and even this 80s sounding like keyboard guitar solo kind of thing. It's perhaps not as spacious as my favorite tracks here. The mix on this track can sound a little squished and overstuffed. And the way these sounds go up against the wonky beatwork gives me mild Flume vibes, I guess, but it still undoubtedly makes for a satisfying and climactic finish to this project. So yeah, that's everything on Ego Death. A lot of major high points, a lot of points I'm kind of conflicted on too, But I think if this one's going to be sticking with me, the high points are going to be leaving a lot more of an impact. And even if I don't love every track as much as the next, it is definitely an accomplishment that I never feel compelled to skip any of it. The whole thing fits together too well as a complete whole for me to want to break it apart in any way. I suppose we'll find out how much this ends up still standing on its own or sticking with me long term, especially when Hudson Lee drops his album next week. I have a feeling that guy's going to be delivering a similar experience to what I got here. But as of right now, I definitely had a lot of fun with this. It got better with every listen I gave it. And if you're a fan of material in this genre I can co-sign just as much as everyone else has, I'll give this an 8.3 out of 10. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters. They're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list or make me review something, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.